Good morning. Good morning, everyone. As people are joining in, welcome to another Shamanic Coffee Hour. Yes, I'm drinking out of a mug with my picture of my strange face on it. It's a gift from my children. If you've watched the series The Office, you might recognize the design of the mug. My children have a great sense of humor. I think it's safe to say they get that from me mostly. So, just delightful. It was a delightful gift. Today I'm drinking, if you're interested, Green Mountain Coffee Roasters Nantucket Blend, which is a lovely medium roast. I'm a fan of the medium roasts. So, experimenting a little bit with starting this earlier. I've been doing these usually starting a half an hour later, for whatever random reason. I don't know. But I'm, an early riser, and so I'm starting this one earlier if you're watching it live. Good morning. Thank you for joining again. So I'm starting a little bit earlier today just for as an experiment, I guess. I'll take my I usually take the logo off because I like to have the chat showing up on the sidebar so I can see what people, and sometimes it covers up what people are saying. So anyway, today I'm going to talk about mental health and spirituality a little bit. And there'll be a couple of caveats. One is that I'm not a medical practitioner, licensed mental health person. I can't, nothing, even nobody could, but I definitely can't diagnose anybody with anything over YouTube or diagnose anybody anyway. Um, would not be something I'm allowed to do, but I deal with mental health on quite a regular basis in my practice as a shamanic healer. Um, the issues that people come to me with vary, but usually involve a component of what I'll call the mind spirit, right? The mind. So we have mind, body, spirit. Usually people come to me with sometimes physical issues, but at the core of what people come to me with is usually some kind of trauma, grief, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And then one of the reasons why I want to talk about mental health today is somebody contacted me. Somebody sent me an email who tunes into these, and um, said, had read this. There's a famous article out there that it's all over the place. So I don't know what the uh, copyright is or whatever, but it's uh, something along the title is something along the lines of what does a shaman see in the mental health ward, right? What's a shaman see in a mental hospital? And it talks. It's an interview or examining the perspective of a pretty well-known guy, Maladoma Some, who's a West African shaman. Spent a lot of time in the U.S. Was, I believe, educated in the U.S. and has a great book out there. I recommend it. I can't remember the title. Has the word water in it, but if you look up Maladoma Some or West African shamanism, you'll find it. Um, Last name is Some, I believe, Some, and I won't spell Maladoma because I don't remember exactly how it's spelled, but you can find it anyway. There's this famous article out there that's written from his perspective. I guess it's an interview, and it's talking about the way that we treat people with mental health issues in the West, particularly in the U.S., where he spent time. And the difference in perspective from somebody who comes from a traditional shamanic tribal community um, to the Western medical perspective. So I don't want to. I'm definitely not going to come in here and bash on Western medicine. Western medicine does the best job that it can, and it has its flaws, like everything. Um, but in my experience, it is filled with people who want the best for their patients. And unfortunately, particularly in the US, our healthcare system has become about insurance companies and profits and all kinds of stuff. So um, there are problems, but I have no problems with the practitioners, and I don't have problems with Western medicine. If people come to me as a client with some sort of health problem, including mental health problem, um, I will usually insist that they are under treatment by a licensed healthcare practitioner, and that's just responsible from my perspective. Um, there's nothing I'm going to do that's going to interfere with anything Western medicine's going to do. So why not get the best of all worlds, right? If you came to me with a broken arm, I would drive you to the emergency room so the bone could be set and a cast could be put on. And then I might do a ceremony on your behalf to try to speed healing along, or, help you recover from the trauma of having broken your arm. I think these things can go hand in hand really well. Um, the state of mental health care, I would say, is it's worse. And part of the problem is that we don't have a really great understanding of mental health. And take we're learning, and when I say we, I mean sort of Western medicine. We take a very we take the medical perspective first of all, right? We say, oh, this person is has been depressed for more than 2 weeks, therefore they have major depressive disorder. That's a chemical imbalance in the brain. Maybe. Maybe it is. There's not a lot of evidence for that. There's evidence that, you give people certain medications, some percentage of them respond to that, right? Some percentage of people respond to SSRIs and other things. And I'm not saying SSRIs are bad or don't do them. I would never say anything like that. Some people get very upset when I talk about this, and I apologize. It's not my intention. I'm just pointing out the fact of the matter that SSRIs, I think, work for about 50% of the people, which tells me that even something like depression is not a very simple biological thing to solve. Now, there are some fantastic experiments going on now, and some treatments that are available in psychedelic medication, for example, ketamine therapy, ketamine assisted therapy, which we've known for 50 years can stop symptoms of depression. Still not necessarily like FDA stamp of approval on using it for that purpose, but when people have been suicidal, for example, and the EMTs show up and they need to medicate somebody who's sort of out of control or dangerous, they'll they have often used ketamine, which is you might have heard of it as a party drug or whatever. I guess they would call it a tranquilizer, or it also has anesthetic properties. So it was used in the battlefield in Vietnam and all kinds of stuff. Um, what they found is they would give these, as an emergency, they would give people an injection of ketamine, and um, they would cease being depressed for a period of time. Like symptoms would go away. That wasn't the intent. The intent was just to tranquilize them so they could be stabilized, but then their symptoms wouldn't return for quite a long period of time. And so what they found recently, I guess, is that there is some ketamine, amongst its other effects, has creates a state of neuroplasticity where the brain can rewire itself. Why is that important? Well, a lot of mental health issues, in my opinion, and in a lot of the research, show up as actual physical changes in the brain. You can look at a depressed brain and see that there are physical differences. You can look at a brain with trauma and Good chemistry. Oh, yeah, between soul and psychedelic. Yeah, there's a ton of psychedelic research right now going on uh, in the therapeutic community, a ton. It's not just ketamine. I'm just speaking about that because I've read about it recently, but they're experimenting with, MDMA which is ecstasy, was originally invented for therapy. It's a synthetic drug, was invented for use by therapists until it was outlawed. Very effective, it's been shown. MDMA assisted therapy, psilocybin, um, ayahuasca, all of these things. And there are reasons why shamanic cultures, many of them used psychedelics, still use psychedelics today. And I'm not going to recommend in this. I'm not going to recommend anything. I'm not going to recommend for or against the use of psychedelics in spiritual or healing practice. I think there, my opinion is that they are incredibly valuable and show a significant amount of promise. Um, in research that's been done recently, but and have been used by traditional cultures for millennia. But there are problems in that a lot of these things are being taken out of their cultural context and administered by people without experience, and they aren't necessarily without dangers. A big one is ayahuasca, and a lot of people have been going for ayahuasca ceremony, but what you don't hear about is that ayahuasca can kill you. It's serotoninogenic. If you can die from serotonin syndrome, and it has happened. You can be hospitalized. I've known, my teacher in shamanism is a very, pretty well-known healer, and she has tons of clients who have come back from Peru or wherever to do ayahuasca ceremonies and have been hospitalized in a mental health facility. And I don't know the situation of under which it's been administered, but it became a big industry. And so sometimes when money comes into things like the American healthcare system, it can take the good of something and really twist it around. So, caution is urged. Psilocybin appears to be fairly safe. I'm not sure of the action of psilocybin, but it doesn't appear to have the same kind of effect. I don't know much about the other psychedelics out there. I do know that there are cultures that do peyote ceremony and psilocybin. Uh, Fly agaric mushrooms, Amanita muscaria, are very popular amongst sort of the Arctic shamanic communities. In my practice, I don't use psychedelics. Wouldn't be legal, first of all, but also not necessary to do the things I need to do or the things that I'm teaching people how to do. Not necessarily to use psychedelics there. Pardon me. Coffee went down the wrong pipe a little bit. So let's talk about the perspective. So I'm going to talk about mental health, but my background, of course, is going to filter everything I'm saying. My background is in shamanism, so um, you know, there are certainly lots of other perspectives, and I respect those. But I'm going to talk about it mainly from a shamanic perspective, the intersection of mental health and spirituality. That's what I'm here to talk about, and how they can kind of work hand in hand. So I need to go into my own story a little bit, not because not to be egocentric or anything like that. I'm not, and part of the point of my story is that I'm not particularly special. So if I can heal from my situation, I think anybody can. I don't think, again, I'm not special. I'm not smarter than anybody, wiser than anybody. I happen to have found shamanism at a really good time, or not good time, really bad time in my life, really important point in my life, which happens to a lot of people. I'm not the only person who comes to shamanism from crisis. So we'll go back a little bit. So my whole life, I had been suffering from very hidden. I hid everything really well. Depression and anxiety. Um, when when I had children, things sort of peaked and got really bad for me, and then some things occurred, and I started having some flashbacks of things occurring from when I was a child. Um, and that I was diagnosed with major depressive disorder, and then I was diagnosed with PTSD. And that seemed to open the floodgates for me, really make turn my life upside down. I got physically ill. Um, you cannot really separate mind, body, and spirit. They're the same thing. It's just one big continuum, mind, body, and spirit, right? So PTSD for me was an illness of the soul, but that filtered through my emotions and my cognition, but also wound up affecting my body significantly. So I lost about 60 pounds. I couldn't eat, wasn't sleeping, had all kinds of issues. My doctors were concerned for me. My adrenals were almost burned out. I had adrenal fatigue. I had all kinds of stuff. And I went through all kinds of testing for things. Right. Um, I decided not to, after doing a significant amount of research, I decided not to go the route of SSRIs, which probably would have shortened the duration of the crisis I was in. But, I made that choice. I made the choice not to use SSRIs. And I'm not saying that's the wrong, that I'm not making anybody's choice for them. This was my personal choice. You make your choice under the advisement of medical professionals. But I've been a meditator my whole life, and I trained in tantric Buddhism and some other spiritual disciplines. And as part of what I was doing to try to get better, I was meditating every day for extended periods. I was doing meditation, exercise, watching my diet, taking supplements, going to therapy, doing couples therapy with my wife at the time, and all kinds of stuff. And the thing that was really pushing me is that I really wanted to be a better dad to my children, and I couldn't be the dad that I wanted to be if I was so sick and so depressed. I couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't, was having trouble working. So one day I was meditating and sitting on the cushion on the floor, and I heard it sounded like somebody was standing over me. It was a very strong male voice that said, "You need to learn shamanism." It sounded like it came from outside of my head. And it was very convincing. And I'm not one to have a lot of auditory hallucinations or auditory experiences like that. So it seemed weird to me. I didn't know anything about shamanism. I didn't, um, you know, I knew the word. I'd probably seen images of traditional shamans from Mongolia or whatever. I was like, shamanism, like what? How's that going to work? I live in Maine in the U.S. I don't live in Siberia. I don't, I'm not, indigenous. How am I gonna? How's that gonna work? So as it turns out, Maine has a very vibrant shamanic community, and I found a teacher who became my teacher. But I contacted her and I said, "Look, I think I'm supposed to do this, but I don't know what's going on." She said, "Got an apprenticeship coming up, but you have missed my introductory course, and that's a requirement for doing this apprenticeship." And I was like, "Oh, okay." She said, "But if you come meet with me in my office, I will, you know, we'll have a conversation and we'll see what we can do." So I did. I might have spent a couple hours with her in her office, and she said, "Okay," and I talked about going through this dark night of the soul, and I talked about omens that were coming up for me, and what interested me in shamanism. And she's whatever she saw. And she um she allowed me into her apprenticeship program. I had to do some work beforehand, but nothing like diving in head first, I guess. So I studied with her over about 7 years, I think. So I did an apprenticeship with her, and then initiatory training and teacher training, and I learned soul retrieval from her, all kinds of stuff. So along the way, um, went through a lot of what we would call initiations. And I had no intention ever of working with anyone else, with ever teaching shamanism or becoming a healer and practitioner. I just wanted to learn this tech to heal myself. And that's the way a lot of people come into it, and that's totally fine. And if you never want, if you still never want to work with anybody else, that's totally fine too, because I believe that when you heal yourself, you heal the world. And on a very practical level, not just this saying that, sounds like some, spiritual aphorism. You heal yourself, you heal the world. No, on a very real level, how I show up in the world, how this body mind shows up in the world, how I parent my children is the legacy that I'm going to leave. If I'm able to be kind and compassionate and caring and give my energy to the world, I can make the world a better place. And so by healing myself, I can be better at making the world a better place. A lot of work, a lot of tears, a lot of emotional stuff. To shorten my story significantly, here I am. I almost didn't survive. That was quite a long time ago now, but I almost didn't survive. I was very, very ill, and here I am. And that was all continuum: mind, body, spirit. So let me talk a little bit about how some other cultures handle mental health that plays into things spiritually. So, from a shamanic perspective, sometimes a mental health crisis looks like is turned into spiritual awakening. That was what happened for me. Does every psychotic break in the world turn into spiritual awakening? No, not necessarily. But part of the reason is we're not trying. We're not helping people in the way that they are helped in other cultures. So, in some shamanic cultures, the way that soul retrieval ceremonies, and if you don't know, soul retrieval is the shamanic treatment for trauma mainly. Um, the way that it works is if somebody goes through some kind of trauma, the tribe kind of gathers around them, and then the shaman comes and performs the ceremony to help the person heal, but they're completely supported by their entire community through the whole process. We don't do that. We don't have that here. I know there are, you know, very minor exceptions to that where, there are communities that really gather up around people. You see that in communities of faith, for example, that kind of thing. The we generally, somebody passes away or, somebody goes through something, we might show up for them. We might, bring them a casserole dish or something, but we don't take care of them the way that they do in tribal culture. And I think that we're missing that in modern Western culture. I have a hard time describing that. It's sort of I don't want to say that other cultures aren't modern, but I just mean um, this is not a pejorative against any tribal culture. In fact, great deal of respect for how they do things. What I mean by modern culture is just newer cultures. It's cultures that have sprung up around things like capitalism and the industrial revolution and things like that, where that aren't as don't have the history. So what we did with for lots and lots of time with people who went quote unquote mad is we locked them up. We made spectacles out of them. We tortured them. I live not far from a former state mental health facility, and I can tell you there's some well, it has been transformed. It's this beautiful campus now with mixed of businesses and official buildings and beautiful grounds and well taken care of, and there's a farm with animals and all kinds of stuff. um there's some bad energy still in that place. I don't 100% know what went on there, but the people were locked up there. So that's what we did. We needed to take them away and lock them up rather than surround them. And, there was an experiment that was done, forever. They did experiments about addictive drugs, like cocaine and heroin, where they would put a rat in a cage and it would have a bottle of water and a bottle of water that was laced with the drug that they were testing. And the rat would, of course, get addicted to the drug and use that until they died. Um, and it usually died very quickly. And then, I forget when it was, but it was decades ago. An experimenter looked and said, "Well, the problem here is that in this experiment, this rat is alone in the cage. Like they have no stimulation. There's no socialization, right? They're not interacting with other rats. They're locked alone in this cage." So he created an experiment where they had um, you know, a cage where the rats all lived together, and there was lots of stimulation, lots of, I don't know if they had wheels to run on or whatever, and different colored things, and lots of cheese and whatever. And almost no addiction happened. Almost no, the rats did not prefer the drug laced stuff, and they lived normal lives, you know. So what does that tell you is that our environment really shapes our mental health, and our behavior, in fact, can shape addiction. So what do we do? What do we do with a lot of drug addiction is that people wind up getting arrested, they wind up going to jail, they don't get treated, or they go to prison or whatever. Oh, do they? Um, yeah, yeah, yeah. So a lot of studies are like that. A lot of studies that are not to bash science. I think science is great. A lot of studies that things are based on once something becomes really doctrine and science, it's hard to buck, right? Like the whole thing with saturated fats being really bad for you, and butter being bad for you, and all those things was uh, completely made up by the sugar industry to have more sugar included into foods, into processed foods, decades ago, and in my opinion, created the obesity epidemic that we see in the U.S. in particular. How many people have they killed, basically from poor health, and things like diabetes and metabolic disorder and heart disease and all of this stuff? But all that was made up. But you still like find people telling you, you need to avoid saturated fats. You know, but the science that it was based on was not great. But yeah, I'm going to check out that book, Good Chemistry. I would be very interested in reading that. But yeah, so they found that these rats, when they had stimulation, when they had social support and things to do and whatever, but we incarcerate people for minor drug offenses in this country. We don't treat people for addiction in the right ways. And addiction and trauma, I think I would say that trauma in the world is a silent epidemic because people are not treated for trauma. There's a lot of silent trauma. You know, Nearly 100% of my clients come to me with trauma. Nearly. So trauma causes all kinds of problems, and not just for us, but trauma is sort of handed along, from generation to generation, unfortunately. And if you're not the kind of person who says, okay, I had, trauma in my history, I know that I could pass that on to my kids, I can pass that traumatic background on to my kids, I'm going to stop it here. Which is what happened with me. You can put a stop to the generational trauma. One of the issues is that we can see um, epigenetic changes in traumatized populations multiple generations later. So, for example, we can look at changes in the way that genes express themselves amongst the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. That's how much trauma changes us. This is what I'm talking about, that mind, body, and spirit are a continuum and that they aren't separate things, right? We think about trauma just being in the mind, but trauma is also in the body and it's also in the soul. What happens from a shamanic perspective when we experience trauma is that a part of us leaps away to, hey, how are you? Elaborate on autism and what the spiritual causes are of the condition. That's a good question. I'll talk about that in a moment. I don't have a lot of experience with autism in particular, and I don't know that I've ever worked with somebody specifically regarding autism as far as what the spiritual. But well, I'll talk about that in a moment. I definitely want to uh, finish my thought on trauma before I lose it. So one of my diagnoses is ADHD. If you can tell, I jump around a little bit. So if I get too far off track, you can remind me to get back on track. Um, so anyway, what happens with the way that we view shamanically, we view trauma is that part of us, we feel unsafe, right? Something scares us. That's what trauma is. It's a giant, it's a sort of an existential fear brought into being. And the way that trauma affects us really differs depending upon lots of factors, right? The source of the trauma, right? So childhood trauma usually comes from the people who are taking care of us, really makes us feel unsafe at a core level. You get trauma from warfare. You can see the horrors that human beings do to other human beings. And part of what makes trauma affect us more is our ability to control any of the situation, right? So sometimes you might get into a car accident or something that, oh, I ran a red light or whatever, and you may or may not be traumatized by that. But if somebody were to do something similar to you, commit an act of violence, you don't have any control, but it's also coming from another human being who's disregarding your status as a human being and your right to exist peacefully and not be harmed and all of those things. So um, those things can compound trauma. Not having a safe person to go to if you're going through a traumatic situation, all kinds of stuff we know can compound trauma. From a shamanic perspective, part of you leaps away and gets stuck. Part of you leaps away to safety. Part of your soul leaps away and gets stuck. And we call that soul loss. It's like a little bit of you, a little bit of your essence jumps away and gets stuck in time. So that part of you doesn't grow up exactly, right? As you are growing up, if it's happening in childhood, or it doesn't progress in time, which is why we can get really stuck in those moments. We can have flashbacks, which maybe spiritually, maybe signals coming from those earlier memories and that are like out here. And so shamanically we try to restore that. Well, a lot of people who look at trauma from a mental health perspective will talk about the fractured self, right? The fractured identity, the sort of portioning off. We'll talk about things like dissociation, right? Depersonalization and disreality, which are, depersonalization feels like you're not in touch with your body or not in control of your body. Maybe you're floating above it or floating behind it. And derealization, which is, a type of dissociation where you feel like the world around you isn't real, like you're in a dream, or kind of feels like you're underwater, or can feel different ways to different people. But those kinds of things are, when somebody comes to me and starts talking about having dissociation, I usually as in 100% know there's trauma there. When we explore it a little bit, there's in my experience 100% of the time trauma underneath that. Sometimes unacknowledged trauma, unrecognized trauma. um, but I will say that dissociation is a survival mechanism. It just happens to be It's like an autoimmune disorder. Like your immune system is really important to your survival, but if it's overactive, it can attack you and cause other problems. So it has to be in balance. And dissociation is a survival mechanism, but if it's happening in inappropriate times, it's not what you want. It's sort of overactive. So soul loss can lead to all of the problems that we associate with PTSD, depression, anxiety, a feeling of another one that I don't know shows up in the the medical literature or anything, but something that people talk about with me is this feeling of disconnection. It's almost like being dissociated from life. So people describe it as a feeling of disconnection from the world or from their family or from even from themselves. And again, that's really, that screams soul loss to me usually when people come to me with that. So I think, for people with trauma, I want to see them in trauma informed therapy. If they need medication to, manage things, I want that to see them do that. But then, you can also come to me or another shamanic healer and work through some soul retrieval, work through some things along those lines. And it's soul retrieval, in my experience, is very, very impactful work. It takes time. You have a ceremony, and usually people feel something, some sense of relief with that ceremony, but then it gets better over the next 5 or 6 weeks. And why is that? Because that part that we've sort of reunited you with is integrating with your system. So I like to, let's hit things on all fronts. Let's do things for your body. Let's do some trauma releasing exercise. Not me, but do some trauma releasing exercises for your body. Do some trauma informed yoga therapy. Do, meditate, work out, do, take care of your body. If you need medication to feel well or get better, then do that. But then in the meantime, you can also do self-care and do spiritual work for yourself or with a healer. But I always tell people that shamanic healing or any sort of spiritual healing is not a replacement for your licensed medical practitioner. The things that they can do that I can't do, I can't work on the body the way they can. So we're working on different levels of stuff that you have. You have a body, you have a soul, you are a spirit. That part doesn't need work. That part is always perfect, whole, and complete, and you don't have to worry about that too much. Um, so let's talk about somebody had asked about autism and the spiritual causes of autism. I don't want to say definitely. I don't have a lot of experience with working with autism, and autism is, I don't know if it's described as a mental health disorder as much as it is being, it's neurodivergent and yeah, body awareness practices. Yeah, and there's some stuff called I think trauma releasing exercise as well. There's a lot of somatic work around trauma that I think is great, and I think it's a great angle. A lot of trauma is stored in the body. We lose touch with our body, and that can help with even the soul retrieval process. The integration work afterwards may involve some body work, and that's great stuff. I've told people to go out and do, tai chi or qigong or something, or yoga, something to get into back into the body a little bit. Um, so yeah, I don't know what the spiritual causes of autism would be. You know, autism is, so one of the, we have this term neurodivergent, and technically I'm neurodivergent. I like the word neurospicy. Somebody taught me that recently. Um, and autism is a different, physically it's a different type of, it's neurological, and um, autism shows up again, and like it's this huge spectrum, and people talk about being on the spectrum. Um, and I'm not really an expert in autism, but It just seems to me like it lumps a lot of things into one ginormous category of things. But it's very interesting. I worked in computer science for over 2 decades, and there are a lot of people who are attracted to that who are would be considered on the spectrum. Um, their genius just sh- their genius shows up in a different way. So we all have different different superpowers, I guess, right? So when I talk, having ADHD, for example, and PTSD presents certain challenges to the way that I do things, but it also shows up as a superpower in my life. And what do I mean by that is that, um, with part of my ADHD means I can become, it doesn't mean I'm just all scattered all over the place all the time. But what it does mean is that I can become hyper focused on a single topic. So, for example, like, um, I'm like, oh, I'm really interested in martial arts when I was younger, right? Well, then I wound up, most people will go to like one or two martial arts classes and quit, or they might stick with it for a year or a couple of years or whatever. Well, I trained for several decades and taught and, got a third degree black belt in jujitsu and, got a teaching license and all this stuff. Um, but my ability to like really dive in and get obsessed about a single topic, and the same thing was true for shamanism, right? I really dove into shamanism and it became home for me. So it is a little bit about just showing up in a different way for me. And I don't know, I can't say that there is a spiritual cause of that. Some things are organic. And maybe there's a spiritual component to that. But some things are just organic, right? If I've broken my arm, there may or may not be a spiritual cause to that. That doesn't mean to say there isn't relief that can be happen there. Yeah. Yeah, the dive in approach with everything. Yeah, that's me, right? So I've loved to like draw and paint my whole life, and my dad was a painter. My aunt was I wouldn't say like famous painter, but my aunt was a really amazing painter. Had a studio in Boston, won a bunch of awards, did a bunch of commission work. She was a professional painter, really skilled in watercolor in particular, and that sort of thing. And lately, I've been like really, and my girlfriend is an artist, and I love that. Like I can see her studio from here. She's got this like amazing setup with all her paint tubes and all this stuff. But right now our entire dining room is covered with painting stuff. Like I'm diving into um painting, or we're doing portraits, and we're doing this sort of impressionist portraits right now. And like I'm like, oh, I'm gonna get everything. I'm gonna get all the paint, all the brushes, all the we in fact we've stretched some of our own canvases and all kinds of stuff. And I am in no way a professional artist. I don't have, I am definitely not as skilled as she is, or over time I'm I will get better, but it's really something I'm like, yeah, I'm all in on this. I'm all in. I'm gonna do portraits now. I'm not just gonna paint a duck or paint a tree or whatever. But that sort of thing sort of kind of ran in my family. So I tend to jump in it and run with things, and that's part of ADHD for me. That for me is a little bit of a superpower. Like I can learn a lot of stuff on my own if I channel that. I learned, I didn't have a degree in computer science. I was just working, very, in the early 90s. I was just, working at like a store or something, and I ran into a guy, and he's like, I just got a contract for doing computer programming. I'm like, you don't even have a college degree, dude. And he's like, yeah, they don't care. at the time, and so I'm like, well, I'm gonna teach that to myself, and I did, and then I got my first job, and then spent a couple decades doing that, um, with no degree in computer science or anything like that. Um, just found stuff that didn't really matter. But so that's part of it. And for some people, autism can represent uh absolutely challenges, but it can also be a little bit of a superpower. I think you just have to look for it a little bit. I've got a good friend whose son is autistic, but is also a very talented musician, and y- good with computer programming and just really good at certain things. And I know I've met, uh, like I said, a lot of people in computer science who are very, very good at that. Now, that isn't to say that everybody who's on the spectrum is going to be good at that, but I think we look sometimes we look at things as disabilities that don't necessarily have to be, because they don't like the person with that particular challenge or difference, we'll just say difference, doesn't fit into the mold of what our culture says is valuable or okay or whatever. And that's been true for me my whole life. So, but I have a little bit of oppositional defiance disorder. So, somebody in authority tells me I can't do something or I won't be able to do something. Normally, my first response is to figure out how. um, and that's not to say that I'm special. I think that's true for a lot of people. I know, it's funny, my girlfriend and I are so much alike. She's exactly the same way. If I if I ever I would never do this. I'm not a manipulative person, but if I ever, wanted her to do something, I would challenge her and say, "I don't think you can do that." And I know she would. I know she would prove me wrong and do whatever I'm like, "I don't think you can build a shed in the backyard all on your own with lumber you recycle." And she would find a way. I would never do that, but she would find a way to defy. And I'm like that as well. You can't do that. Well, I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you that I can do that. So, and when I was born, part of my story is that I was born with a number of birth defects, and one of them caused me to have my lower leg amputated when I was 18 months old. And when I was born, doctors told my parents, "Your son will never walk. Your son will never learn how to walk." And uh, you know, I guess that goes back to that. I'm like, I was a baby, didn't probably understand what they were saying. Probably helped, but a little bit like, screw that. Everybody else is walking, so I'm going to learn how to walk too. Yeah. Yeah, sometimes we catch on to that, right? Um, yeah, sometimes we catch on to people challenging challenging you to get you to do something. Like I said, I would never do that with my girlfriend, like that as a form of manipulation. I'm not into that, but I'm just saying, like, knowing her and knowing me, that would probably, in a lot of ways be a good way to get me to do something as well. So, kind of the same, kind of feel the same way. Um, you know, I get sort of indignant. One time I remember, I was working in college. I worked in the work study my freshman year. I worked in the admissions office, and when you do that, they have you do, like, I worked as a tour guide on campus, but they also had me doing stuff like data entry, very rudimentary computers back then, but we did put stuff into them, data entry and sorting mail and stuff like that. And I'm working in the mailroom, and we have these sacks of mail because everything back then, of course, there was no email or whatever. Everything went into these big sacks of mail. When somebody they would send in a postcard that say, "I want information about your college," we would have to, put them in. I would data enter them into the computer. We'd print off a bunch of labels, put the brochures together, and they'd go out in these giant sacks of mail. So this guy came in to pick up the mail, and with the punch cards, no, not quite that old, but very close. I think we did actually have a terminal that was networked to some server somewhere, but I remember having to do statistics work on a mini vax computer, entering, hand entering long columns of number. And if you screwed one up, like you enter in like 150 numbers by hand, and if you screwed up the third one, you'd have to like delete it and go back and do the whole thing. So, oh, thank you. I appreciate it. Oh, have a good lunch. Absolutely take care. Um, Um, so where was I? Again, this is what happens with ADHD, right? Oh, so I'm working in the mailroom and this guy comes in, he sees my hands, right? And he says, "Oh, can you hand me that sack of mail?" And he goes, I didn't see your hands. I guess you can't do that. So I'll get that for you." And like it infuriated me. And I was like, 19 years old. So I grabbed, and back then I was doing karate like 5 days a week and working out 7 days a week in the gym. I was in good shape, very strong. And so I grabbed the sack of mail and I actually hurled it at him and kind of like knocked him back into the wall. But, not to say that was a good reaction, but that was sort of my response to indignance that. Oh, yeah, yeah. Remembering the older computer days. Yeah, so I yeah, so I have children. My daughters are 16, and I have my girlfriend's kids are, 15 through 19. And um, is it possible for all of someone's soul to? Oh, yeah. Let me answer that. So anyway, I'll answer that in just a second. I promise. So it's funny because my daughters are teenagers, and so when we run into old things like payphones, and they're like, "What is this amazing thing?" And then I feel like I'm talking about like my grandfather telling me stories of like, "Oh yeah, we used to have coal delivered by horse and carriage, and we'd have to shovel it down into the coal chute in our basement, and that's how we heated our house." When my grandfather was a kid, they had still had horse and wagons running around in the street selling everything. My grandmother just passed away in late February. She was 106. So I feel like that now when my kids and I see a payphone, for example, or like we're watching a show and there's an old computer and they're doing the dial-up thing for, not even the internet, usually like a bulletin board service or AOL or something like that. And you hear that whiny pitch that it used to do with dial-up. If you're really young and watching this, you might not even know what I'm talking about, but internet used to come in through the phones and it used to scream a lot. But yeah, it's, my kids who grew up with surrounded by computer technology and cell phones, and they were issued computers since they were in kindergarten, they were issued computers. So um, they're just never without a computing device, really. And everybody's into their phones and all of that. Um, so the question is it possible for all of someone's soul to separate from the body as a response to severe trauma? So my answer to that is no. Complete soul separation actually leads to physical death. So if you've heard of somebody being, so I guess yes, maybe. If you've heard of somebody being scared to death, which does happen, people get frightened into having a heart attack or something, and they pass away. Now there can be there's a physical response to some severe trauma, right? That can cause a heart attack. Um, and that may or may not be related to severe soul loss. So, but yeah, I guess if, technically, yes, it could happen where the entire soul separates from the body, but the body dies at that point. Which is, what happens at death is that the soul separates from the body completely. So you're not in there anymore. And if you have experienced, if you've ever been, experienced being close to somebody as they were going through the dying process, like in the final days of dying, um, you can tell that a lot of the time they're not really there anymore. And what's happening is they're basically doing what we call soul traveling or astral projection or journeying or whatever. A good portion of them, not the entire portion, or the body would die. A good portion of them is not really attached to the body anymore. They're in the process of dying. When somebody dies and it's not like all of a sudden like a shocking death or something like that, there's kind of this wisping away separation where the soul becomes less and less attached to the body. And, upon death, that soul completely separates. And in my experience, it usually hangs around for a short period of time before hopefully crossing over to wherever it's going. And where you go to, I'll do a whole podcast of what happened, or whatever. I don't know if this is a podcast, but I'll do a whole episode of Coffee Hour on what happens to you after you die. Um, because it's to me it's it was really really eye opening for me to have that experience, which you can get in if you train very deeply in shamanism. You'll go through lots of death experiences and experience the other side, and communicate with others there, and recognize what happens during reincarnation and all kinds of stuff. So it's very cool. It's you know uh interesting stuff, and it dissolves your fear of death a little bit, you know when you realize there's really nothing to be. Oh, good. Yeah, well, my take on it certainly might be not other people's take on it, but it's I've got lots of stories, we'll put it that way. I have done it's not my specialty, but I've done quite a bit of death and dying work. Yeah, me too. I listen to all kinds of talks on spirituality. Um I listen to lots of stuff on Gnostic Christianity to Sufism to Aleister Crowley stuff to really, really fascinated with Jack Parsons, who founded Jet Propulsion Laboratory and studied magic under Aleister Crowley, the wickedest man in the world. Guy had, for a guy living around the turn of the 20th century, knew a lot about propaganda and advertising and self promotion. We'll put it that way. Um, he was one of the first people, I guess, to get so much, like, to actually generate a lot of negative press about himself to become more famous. Not Jack Parsons, but Aleister Crowley. But I'm fascinated with Jack Parsons. If you don't know, there's a great show. I think you can get it on Amazon Prime, but you might have to buy it. Called Strange Angel, which is there's a book, Strange Angel, which is autobiographical. The show is, I would say, semi-autobiographical, because they're definitely important people in the show that never existed, and certain topics that were treated in a kind of a strange way. Um, but some of it is true, and it is definitely based on real people and real incidents and stuff along those lines. So if you're interested in that sort of historical stuff, it's pretty neat. He was a pretty interesting individual. Jack, I think Whiteside is his middle name. Parsons. Um, so um, we're coming close to. I'll talk for definitely a little while longer, but sort of back on topic with sort of the synergy between mental health and spirituality. So one way, and every model of everything is flawed in two ways, right? So if I have a map is a type of model, right? It might be a model. I might have a street map, right, to show me how to get around. Now I've got a phone with a GPS in it, so I use that a lot to navigate. But that has maps in it that it downloads that helps me get from place to place. And that model of the streets around me is very useful for that. But if I needed to know the height of a mountain or the depth of a lake, that GPS map wouldn't help me because it's a model that suffers from two things that all models suffer from. One of those things is called deletion. It deletes information. It doesn't have the height of mountains. Right. And the other thing it has is distortion. So it is not a perfect, no map could ever be perfect because roads are physical things that change over time. Roads and rivers and things change over time, even slightly, even minutely. Everything's in constant flux, but it's accurate enough to be useful for my purposes. So when I get, and so the map is also not the territory. So we know that that map, like I'm not driving on that map, I'm driving on the road. So it's important not to confuse the map for the territory. So there's a model of, I will say, people that I look to sometimes that is somewhat useful, but deletes a lot of information and distorts reality, but it's useful as a way to look at things as a map. That's kind of it. So take it for what it's worth. It's not reality, it's a representation of a view of reality, just like a map is a representation of a view of the reality of the roads outside my house or the topographical information. Or you can have maps, that are used to measure, show population or divide up voting areas or, all kinds of things, right? Different models are useful. They show different information about it. So this is a model of human beings. We'll say, for now, we'll just say humans, just to make it really simple. So I look at humans as this continuum, right? Like the light spectrum or the electromagnetic spectrum, right? That really small portion of magnetic spectrum is light. But we can look at things that are red and we can say that's red light, right? That's red light. Or we can look at things that are green and say that's green light, and that those are two separate things, but they're not really. They're part of their electromagnetism. They just happen to be on a different frequency. So human beings have um, different parts. We can look at that, and so we can also look at that as like having shells or layers like an onion. So we go from one way to look at this, one model of this is that we go from the gross to the subtle. So the grossest level that we're aware of, the most gross, the most material level is the physical body. We have a physical body, right? That's one layer. And that physical body in itself is composed of lots of different parts, right? We've got, systems, we've got limbs, we've got all of these things. We've got sense organs that take information in. So that's one layer. So very close to that layer, but at a layer that's more subtle, is what we call the energy body. Now, this is the aura or the acupuncture and the acupuncture meridians and the chakras and all of those parts. And again, that's extremely complex. It's at least as complex as the human body, probably more complex. This is also known as the etheric body, and there are a couple of major parts to that. We have the etheric double, which is the the etheric force that is very close to very close to the body, within a couple of inches of the body. And then we have the sort of the etheric field, which is known as the aura, and that if you're aware of these things, you can see as a very large shape around us. Now, again, like this is very close to the level of the physical. So some of these things can be measured with electrical or really sensitive equipment, right? Because it's very close to the physical and interacts very strongly with the physical, which is why, you can get acupuncture and have it affect a part of your physical body very quickly, rapidly, instantaneously. My very interesting to me, my girlfriend has 3 children, and all of them at one point, like before the birth, were in breech position, and she went to an acupuncturist for that. An acupuncturist did some work, and the babies turned. How does that work? I don't know, but that's pretty amazing to me. Um, that it worked and led to very healthy births, and that's great news. But these things have been studied significantly, like the acupuncture meridians and all that have tremendous amount of study around them. So sort of the next layer, the next subtle layer, and in drawing like how close it is to the human body or whatever doesn't really make sense because it's so subtle that it's not really connected as much to the physical body. It is connected, but again, it's a layer that exists a little bit outside of space and time. It's still close. It's still closer than other things, but this we would call the soul body, and this is the part that can get injured, quote unquote, injured or lost part or fractured during trauma, and that's what leads to soul loss. This is more subtle than the energy body. Um, you where you might see like an ordinary consciousness, some people can see the energy body. It's much harder to see a soul body, although some people see ghosts and things like that. People I've seen some stuff, we'll put it that way. But there's usually an energetic component to that, which is what people are seeing, which is why we don't see ghosts all the time. We're surrounded by spirits all the time, and we don't always see them because they're not vibrating, for lack of a better term, at a wavelength that is within our physical our sense organs can detect, can pick up. um it's very interesting. Also, a lot of them aren't aware of us, because we're at a different layer than they are as well. And it's a little bit like this is where things like parallel universes and things like that come into play. So the soul body is not as heavily attached to the physical body, and this can travel, right? This is what in shamanic journeying, this is what we do, and astral projection, this is what we do. Which is why a lot of people in shamanism come from a history of trauma because we're used to dissociation. It's just in shamanism we do it on purpose. We separate from the body on purpose, and we do it, um, you know, with intention, as opposed to dissociation that happens that you're not in control of. So one of the things the practice of shamanism has given me is much more control over dissociation. I used to have real problems with dissociation, before I started training at shamanism, and now I have a lot more control over whether I'm in my body or out of my body, whether I identify with the body or not. And identifying with the body is not that, disidentification with the body is not the same thing as dissociation. It just means that I know this is not who I am at my core. Okay. So we have this soul body. So then there's this other part of you that's even more subtle than that. It's so subtle, in fact, that it lives outside of really time and space. It's not really connected to time and space. Well, it's less connected to the physical body. It doesn't We can visualize it as having a location, but that doesn't, in the scheme of things, doesn't really make sense. Sometimes seen as like a pinpoint of pure white light that shines infinitely, and is connected to all things. And this is what we in shamanism call the spirit. Some people would call that the soul and reverse soul and spirit or whatever, but you know, this is just the way that I'm using this term. This is your spirit. This is a spark of pure divinity, of pure creative potential at the core of awareness, which is what you really are, is pure awareness. Um, but it's like this individuated spark. And this spark cannot be, because it doesn't have location or size or mass or anything like that, it cannot be separated or divided or injured or any of those things. It is the perfect part of you because it's divine. It's an aspect of divinity, and we all have that. So when, the I realize, in yoga class when they say namaste, that it's basically saying my higher self recognizes your higher self, or my enlightened nature recognizes your enlightened nature. Um, this is basically that underlying divine nature that we all have. There is something underneath all of that. So that is this, the level of spirit, this divine layer. There is something that is even subtler than that, and that is pure awareness, and that's what we are. That's in which everything arises. It's completely undifferentiated. So, for example, if you and I are having a conversation, that both sides of that conversation are arising in the same awareness. We have different viewpoints because there are two body minds that are interacting, but the awareness of the conversation is one thing. Gets really, really abstract, right? So when we look, okay, and so those are some of the major bodies that I've described. That's sort of the body model. But there are other sort of layers in there. And one is sort of the mental layer, right? The layer in which thoughts and feelings arise. And this is very strongly tied to everything, right? Everything's tied to everything. Again, it's all one thing on the same spectrum, right? It's all coming out of source, basically, or divinity, and arising in awareness, which is what we are at our purest, finest, most subtle level, is we are pure awareness. So, um, dis-ease, discomfort, whether that's a mental health disease or physical disease, can affect and be affected by almost all of those layers, right? Like I said, there are layers that are so subtle they don't change. Like the layer of pure awareness is unchanging. It's completely still, completely quiet and unchanging. It's like it's like a field. It's like the movie screen at a project at a it's like the screen at a movie theater, right? And you're projecting things onto that. Those are the experiences that are arising in awareness. If you don't like the movie, you don't go and try to change the screen, right? The screen just sits there. It shows whatever movie appears on it. You have to change the movie. You have to change the projection, and you can do that in a number of ways, right? You can swap out the movie that you're playing, or you could turn the projector off, or you could project something over that, but you don't change the underlying thing that you're projecting. You don't change the screen itself. So, um, so health, including mental health, can be accessed from all of these different layers. So things like medication, exercise, diet, even hydration can affect mental health at a physical level. Things like trauma releasing exercises and yoga and that sort of thing. We can affect mental health at the level of the energy body. We can do acupuncture, qigong, tai chi, reiki, all kinds of energy healing stuff, and that will spill through into the mind body. And we can affect things on the soul level. We can do soul retrieval work, or we can do ancestral healing, or past life healing, or parallel life healing. These are all, things in the shamanic tool belt for healing mental health stuff. Yeah, ancestral stuff affects us as well. We have connections to our ancestors. Right. I talked about that before, how we can pass ancestral trauma down even genetically. So that's, there's a physical aspect to that, but there's also a mental aspect and an emotional aspect and an energetic aspect. Right. And when somebody goes out of balance or out of whack, sometimes and I'm not just saying like somebody's off balance mentally. I'm saying their system goes out of balance that can have different effects. It can have mental health effects, physical health effects, both, which is what happened to me. And so bringing those, addressing each of those layers in my mind. is like firing on all cylinders. If you have a car, if you don't know how car engines work, I'm talking about combustion engines. I don't know. I know a little bit about how electric motors work, but combustion engines have pistons, right? Or what they call cylinders. The cylinders hold the pistons, and we call it, firing on all cylinders. You might have a six-cylinder car, and there are little like the things that are making the pistons go up and down that make your wheels turn. Um, there are little explosions that are going on inside those pistons, right? And so if you have six pistons and only three of them are firing, your car has only half of its power, right? So the expression firing on all cylinders is what that means, is that all of those cylinders are working. So we have all these cylinders, right? We have a mind and a body, and we have emotions, we have an energy system, we have a soul body. So when we're looking for healing, we can address all of those layers, not just healing, but anything we want to do or accomplish. We we want to get those things into alignment. If I set a goal, for example, of I'm going to get into shape, I'm going to go to the gym, whatever, and I have that's mental and emotional, but I don't ever leave my house. I don't get in my car and go drive to the gym. Well, I'm not going to get into shape because the physical part is not working. And if I go and I get a gym membership and I go to the gym, but my mind's not in it, and I'm not, you know, just kind of putzing around and not doing my exercise, well, I'm not going to get into shape either. And that's because my mental emotional state is not in alignment. Okay. And so there are all kinds of aspects to the spiritual levels, getting the energy body into alignment, getting things fixed. If I've got an energy blockage somewhere, I might need acupuncture or shamanic extraction, or I might need to do some exercises on my energy body, right? Like Tai Chi, Qigong. I mention those a lot because they're the ones I know. I'm sure there are others out there. Okay. I might need to do some yoga, get my energy body straightened out and into alignment. Why am I working out and I just, I'm feeling tired all the time? I don't have the energy to work out, and I'm not getting any stronger. I'm not losing any weight. I'm not doing this. I'm not doing that. Look at everything. Look at what's going on. What are you eating? Are you hydrating? Take care of the physical. What's your mental state? How do you get into focus with doing what you need to do, and your emotional state about that? And there are lots of ways to approach that as well. What's your energy body doing? Is it recovering? Are you taxing that? Are you relying too much on that? Is it not healthy? Do you have blockages? Okay. And then we get your soul body into alignment too. And for that, we normally need we normally need some shamanic intervention there. So um anyway, this is I've been talking about 20 minutes longer than I planned on it. I'm gonna end, but thank you so much for joining me, especially people who have come back and joined me again. I appreciate seeing some of the same folks. Thank you for joining in. I hope this has been a little bit informative and given you some ways of thinking about mental health in conjunction with spirituality. And I do want, my biggest goal is to have everybody, first of all, love themselves enough that they're worthy of doing self-care, but they feel worthy of doing, you are worthy of doing self-care, but to love yourself enough that you feel like it's worthwhile to take care of yourself, and take care of yourself at all levels, whatever that means. Your mind, body, spirit, emotions, energy body, soul body. Take care of all of it. And with that, I'll leave you. And again, like, this topic was suggested by somebody. I'm very happy to entertain other topics. I know we talked about doing talking about death next time, which I'll probably set that up as a topic for next week, unless something comes up that I feel like I should talk about more. But I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to talk about some different perspectives on death. So you have a great Friday as well. It is Friday. It is Friday. Happy, if you're going into your weekend, have a happy weekend. I mean, we're all going into the weekend, but, I mean, if you're working and or whatever, um, and you're going into your weekend, I hope you have an enjoyable one. Stay happy and healthy. Love you all. I will